Welcome back to Digital Teacher YouTube. In another video, we looked at reproduction in plants, the definition, the types. We looked at what sexual reproduction is and what asexual reproduction is. We did also look at the flowers as the reproductive unit of plants, and also we looked at the basic or typical structure of a flower. In this video, we'll be looking at the different forms of asexual reproduction in details. Later in the video, we'll be looking at pollination in plants, the different forms of pollination, and also we'll look at agents of pollination or how plants are being pollinated. Come along. So, asexual reproduction involves one plant developing into offsprings that have an identical DNA to their parents. Let's look at a few example types. An example is production of runners. Some plants produce horizontal roots, which are called runners. Along the runners, identical plants could develop and become a daughter plant. For example, this is a strawberry plant with daughter plants growing along the runners. Another example is growth of plants from tubers. This can be seen in potatoes. So tubers are young storage organ of a tuber crop, and it can grow into a new plant if it is left on the ground. So potatoes can be grown from their tubers. Another typical example is the use of bulb. Onions are grown from their young part called bulb. Bulb are also food storage units. So to grow a new onion plant, the daughter bulbs can be grown or planted to develop into a new plant. All these examples are natural propagation of plants. However, we also have the artificial vegetative propagation. This can include cutting. This involves cutting up a section of a plant and putting it in the soil to grow a new plant. Vegetables can be planted using this method. Another is propagation, or what we call culturing. Take extract the cell of a plant, put it in a medium, and produce a new plant from it. Now let's look at pollination in plants. To understand this, you need to know the structure of a flower, which have been explained in the previous video. So you can go to the previous video to familiarize yourself with the parts of a flower. So, in a flower, the male gamete is pollen grain, which is stored in the anther, while the female gamete is the ovules, which are stored in the ovary. Pollen grains must first of all be transferred to the stigma so that the nucleus could travel down the style to fertilize the ovule. This process is called pollination. If you don't already get that definition, pollination is simply the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. It can occur from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower, or from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower on the same plant, or from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower on a separate plant. In the first description, it is called self-pollination, while the second description is called cross-pollination. Although they are different plants, but it must be of the same species. For example, two orange trees. Let's look at the two different strategies for plants to pollinate. These are insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. Insect pollinated flowers. In insect pollinated flowers, the petals are brightly colored so that it attracts insects from their strong scent, their sugary nectars. since they produce a sugary substance that insects can feed. So, the insects visiting the flower to feed on nectars are able to deposit pollen grains from anther to the stigma. Pollen insect flowers are sticky or spiny, so they could easily attach to the feathers or the wings of animals, and in the process of feeding, they help to deposit these pollen grains on the stigma of the same flower or of another flower. Thereby, the pollen grains land on the stigma, achieving the process of pollination. Many insects are pollen eaters. They feed on the sugary nectars. This is not worrisome to the flower because as they feed on the nectars, they help to deposit the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, achieving pollination for the flower. So, insect visiting flowers are able to gain food from the source of the pollen and the nectars, while the flowering plant gain an opportunity to reproduce. This kind of process whereby two organisms interact and benefit from each other is called mutualism. Birds are also able to transfer pollen grains from anther to stigma when they visit the flower. Also, there are some species of bats that also pollinate flowers, and some species of lizards are also able to pollinate flowers. Let's look at wind-pollinated flowers. I know you might not think this is actually a flower of a plant, but it is. These are both the anther and the stigma. This is a maize plant which is growing its flowers. Wind-pollinated flowers are dull colored. They have their stigmas and their anther. They do not possess scent, neither do their pollen grains are sugary. So the structure of a wind-pollinated flower is somewhat different from that of insect-pollinated flowers. Their anthers and their stigma are not enclosed like the insect-pollinated flowers. They are hanging out in the wind, and the stigma are spiky in such a way that they could get exposed to wind and get brushed with the anther to collect pollen grains, which are large, sticky, and spiky in insect pollinated. They are smaller and small in wind pollinated. Pollen grains of wind pollinated are larger in numbers, since only a small fraction of these pollen grains gets deposited on the stigma. Stigmas of insect-pollinated flowers are sticky, while the stigma of wind-pollinated flowers are feathery, allowing wind to pass through it and deposit pollen. Let's look at fertilization and seed formation. Fertilization is the fusion of male gamete with the female gamete to form a zygote. So the male gamete in the pollen grains stored in the anther fuse with the female gamete in the ovules. When the pollen grains land from anther to stigma in process of pollination, the pollen develops pollen tube which grows down the style and down into the ovary, piercing the ovary to fertilize the ovules. So the pollen tube reaches a tiny opening in the ovules, allowing the pollen nucleus to fuse with the egg nucleus in a process that is called fertilization, thereby producing a zygote. The single zygote cell divides and develops to form an embryo. The embryo develops into the plumule and the radicle. The plumule the fruit, while the radicle will become the first root. So we have the plumule, the radicle, and the cotyledon, which stores food for the growing embryo since photosynthesis is not yet taking place. So the cotyledon serves as the food store for the growing embryo. Surrounding the embryo is a seed coat, which is a protecting layer which protects the embryo. So after fertilization, the ovules becomes the seed while the ovary becomes the fruit. So the ovary becomes fruit, the ovules becomes the seed. Thanks for watching. That's all we got for you in this video. Please subscribe to our channel to get updates of our next video.